Hello there and welcome to another episode of The Ins and Outs of Work. My name is Joe, the HR outsider, and here with me, as always, is Neely.
Your HR insider. Welcome.
Brilliant to have you here today on the podcast, where today we're going to be talking about all things pay, benefits, remuneration, call it what you will. It's going to be brilliant. It's a big topic, Neely.
It is a really big topic, Joe, and so we also have a really big guest.
Yes.
Not literally speaking.
Not literally speaking. No. His name is David Buckmaster, and he is an experienced total rewards leader in global Fortune 500 companies. He's currently at Nike. He's been at a bunch of Fortune 500 companies, and he's also the author of a book, Neely.
Yes, and his book is called Fair Pay, and it is a book about how to get a raise, close the wage gap, and build stronger businesses. So there's lots to talk about today, Joe.
Yes, fantastic. And David's role there at Nike is Director of Global Retail Compensation. So phenomenal to have him on the podcast. Thank you so much for saying yes, David. Before we jump to the interview with David, we want to run through a couple of those quick segments that I know you are enjoying on the podcast. Today we're going to cover a Did You Know and our infamous Outsider Outpouring before we jump to the interview with David. So first of all, Neely, a Did You Know?
Did you know, Joe, that the higher your annual salary, the more likely you are to have asked for a raise, and the more likely you are, with just a few exceptions, to have received it.
Wow, I didn't know that. So it's direct correlation between asking for a raise and having a high salary. And there was another Did You Know, wasn't there, Neely?
Yes, there is another Did You Know, Joe. That is about women. They are more likely than men to state that they are uncomfortable negotiating salary. 31% versus 23%. And that holds true even more among C-level executives, where 26% of female chief executives said they're uncomfortable negotiating compared to 14% of male chief executives. Now that, Joe, isn't that surprising, is it?
Well, I think that's going to touch on a bunch of things we talk about with David around the gender pay gap.
Yes.
Other things related to remuneration in companies still today. So a good Did You Know to set the scene there.
Absolutely. And talking about setting the scene, Joe, this is my favorite part of the episode that's now going to come here. I almost hear the clock ticking. It is time for your outsider outpouring.
My outsider outpouring. Thank you, Neely. So this is the moment in the episode where I, as your HR outsider, have a moment to release some passion and have a rant about this topic in the world of work in HR. So we're going to start the clock and we're going to give you 30 seconds to do that. I'm going to do my best to get it in 30 seconds. Here we go. Start the clock. Okay, so as a manager, I've had the experience, of being pulled in two directions when it comes to remuneration and hiring especially. So, the business wants you to keep the costs down. The person who's being hired wants to obviously earn as much as possible. What I find sad sometimes, and it's been my experience, is when a person has asked in an interview for less than I knew I could give them. And that's a sad moment because they're missing out on a bunch. So my rant here today is just to say, back yourself. You need to ask for more even than you think you deserve, or, you need that first moment to be like the company being like, oh my gosh, we can't quite pay you that much. That's a good sign, and then negotiate. Rant over.
Thank you very much for that, Joe.
Yes. We thought about this rant going on about me saying that I'm not paid enough, but we thought that wouldn't be good. So we came up with this rant.
Yeah, I think this was a better one.
Better rant.
Yeah. All right, now without further ado, it is really time to go to our conversation with David. Here it is. But before we go, please, if you haven't done so yet, subscribe to our channel on whatever podcast platform you get your podcasts from. Give us a 5-star rating if you're on Apple Podcasts, and share this episode with a friend. Thank you very much and happy listening.
Enjoy. Hi there, David. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Yes. Before we get started, David, could you please tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself and the work you're doing?
Sure. So, as mentioned, my name is David Buckmaster. I am currently on staff at Nike, where I'm a compensation director there. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this work, we are the people who figure out how much money you make. So we are kind of squirreled away in a corner of the HR department. But that is something that most large companies have. There's always a group of us to do this kind of work. Prior to Nike, I was at headquarters of Yum Brands, which is KFC, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell, doing international compensation for them. And then I was at the Starbucks headquarters before that. So most of my career's been with doing compensation with big, large companies, but I started in the nonprofit space also. Today, I'm actually here in a bit of a different context. So I've written a book. It's come out recently with HarperCollins. The name of the book is Fair Pay: How to Get a Raise, Close the Wage Gap, and Build Stronger Businesses. So today I am here representing that book.
Fantastic, David, and that's exactly what we want to discuss with you is this great book, Fair Pay. I guess the first question, David, and it's a kind of burning question that I've always had as a salaried employee, is, what in your opinion is a fair amount to pay someone, and what kind of goes into that calculation, and how do you even approach that?
Yeah, I wish it were that easy, right? I wish we could say every job there, here's the number, end of story. That would have made for a very short book, right? So my my intent was to say, fair is an extremely loaded word, right? People bring all sorts of baggage into that word, whether it's political or social, whatever context they bring to it. And I leaned into that on purpose because what I think is true is when we start to define what we mean by the word fair, I think it forces the hard conversations that make work better. So while I have really stayed away from declaring a certain amount of pay as fair, whether that means minimum wages or maximums for executives, again, I was really intentional to use this word because ultimately what I think we're asking when we say, am I paid fairly? I think people are really asking, am I paid enough? And I think you can break that down into two different categories. So the first is absolute pay, and the second is relative pay. So when we say absolute, there are components of that. Am I making enough to put the basic building blocks of life together? Do I feel like I have a pathway up here at this company? And then on a relative basis, you start getting into questions around your marketplace value and around your peers doing similar work. Am I paid on a relative basis, commensurate with my experience, with my contributions, compared to the person next to me? So when we say fair, it's am I paid enough? And I think those are the two characteristics, absolute and relative. And that answer is going to be different for everybody.
There's so many things that go into that, and yeah, that's why it's such a great name for your book, Fair Pay.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about that book, David, you describe in your book why the current system of pay is broken. Can you tell our listeners why you believe this is the case?
So, aside from it being kind of a splashy, catch, paragraph to help me sell books, I suppose, I do believe that it is true in the sense that when you do this work for a living, we operate in a very small world, right? We tend to know each other. We go to the same conferences. We look at the same data. And really, there hasn't been that much experimentation in this space in a long time. I think a lot of us are operating from a place of inertia, and then we're benchmarking that inertia off of each other, right? So, and I think strategically that if you're looking at this in the overall grand scheme of your business, like that, it kind of makes sense. And if the attitude is, well, how do we make sure that we can attract and retain talent while also not spending a ton of money, then really, the outcome of that is, well, we should be doing what everybody else is, right? And so when you do that for long enough, and you don't, and like kind of all the power dynamics sit with the company versus the employee, that just introduces this, this operating mindset where there's really just not enough competition or experimentation in this space, right? So I think, over time in that environment, there's this kind of natural tendency to pay to float to, the proximity centers of power, right? Like, there's almost like a decrescendo of kind of who matters in the organization, where of course, when you're closer to the top, kind of the power centers, like, you've got the ability to ask for what you need, and you're really not going to experience much friction. But as you get further down in the organization, these things become a lot harder. So I know you all are based in Europe, where looking at this data, between Europe and the U.S., I think the U.S. has a longer way to go than a lot of countries in Europe to try and bridge some of these gaps. And but I think we're right now, at least, we're seeing some really interesting movement in this space. As we're coming out of the COVID event, people are changing jobs. There's a little bit more power balance, and what we're starting to see what this actually looks like in a more open and free market where companies are having to compete for employees in the same way that they have to compete for customers. And I think that's for the first time in my career, this is really what it should look like. We just haven't seen this before. At least we haven't seen it anytime recently.
Yeah, so things are happening. David, I really want to go off track here for a minute because you said there hasn't been a lot of experimentation. So now I'm wondering, what could experimentation look like? Do we have to think of, because Joe and I before this episode we were talking, about these initiatives that you sometimes hear of companies that let people determine their own salary, or a company I think in the US that raised the minimum wage to, what was it, $70,000 I think. Yeah. So is this what experimentation looks like, or what should we think about?
I think so, because at the root of both of those stories, and the $70,000 is a company that I write about in the book. I actually open with it and close with it in the first and last chapter. So that company is called Gravity Payments. It's based near me in Seattle by a guy named Dan Price, and he's quite vocal online about this kind of stuff, right? And what he found out was one of his employees held a second job at McDonald's because he wasn't paying her enough to make the building blocks of life work for her. So when he found that out, he said, okay, so it seems to me that I'm responsible for this as the leader of my company, that she has to have a second job, right? And I know she's a good contributor, and these are just the choices that I've made about what to pay her. And then so when you unpack that and say, well, where do these numbers even come from? Then you start getting into, well, here's just a standard way of doing compensation, right? Looking at the survey data, paying whatever the survey says, and then just assuming that that is really the market rate, and that market rate is being market relevant is the same thing as being people relevant. And so I think he's made a choice to say, listen, I'm going to understand that market data, but I'm going to do something different. So in that sense, there's a bit of an experimentation to say there's the natural way of doing this, or the way that everybody does, and then there's choices that we can make to maybe look a bit different. I am aware of some companies who do kind of self-set pay. I think this company called Morningstar that does something like that. I would say that's not. I'm super fascinated by the concept. I've not seen big companies do things like this, but I think when we talk about experimentation in pay, it's just challenging the idea of, let's go through every one of our pay programs and say, is this resonant for people, or am I just kind of copying everybody else? I think you've seen some major companies like Netflix and Amazon say, you know what, we don't think bonus plans are serving us very well, and so they've gotten rid of them. They focus more on stock. They know the administration of those bonus plans is really complex and can cause a lot of internal fights, and so they just said, we're gonna operate in a different way. And I think the underlying belief of that is, most companies will say, well, we don't have a bonus plan, people aren't going to work any harder, and it's like, I don't think anybody would look at Amazon or Netflix and say, well, these aren't hardworking people behind these companies, and that they haven't grown as a result. So I think there's something just to say, we've always done it this way, but are there elements of our programs that we can just really either opt out of or do in a different way? And we just don't see enough of that now. It's still kind of at the margins.
So what I'm hearing from you there, David, is there's a sense of like, this is the way it's always been done, so this is just how it has to be, bonuses, and that's how we motivate employees. But perhaps it's time to rethink whether that is actually what motivates people.
Right. And I think to an extent, we overestimate our ability for pay to motivate people. I think there's a lot of research coming out that says, team-based kind of bonuses, those things, work pretty well. The individual level bonuses outside of very specific, sales kind of jobs, like direct sales kind of jobs, like it actually can detract value from your company in a lot of regards, right? Because you create all sorts of unnecessary disincentives around some of these plans. And I think when you really get into it and you say, what am I saying about some of these plans, right? If I say, well, if I'm only going to pay based, on a bonus, then that means that I believe at some level that my people are holding back some element of their best work until I pay them, right? But if you have really clean and effective hiring policies, you hire the right people, your performance management systems are strong, and then you pay in a credible way, then you probably shouldn't. You don't need to rely on the bonus plan, right? That saying, I think there is a place for them in some companies, but I think we just haven't thought that hard about it. Like typically, like in my world, if you pull down the salary survey data and you say this job typically earns a 10% bonus, you're letting that drive your overall design and say, well, this person in the market's going to expect a 10% bonus. Now I have to go design a plan, for it versus it being the other way around. It's like, do we need it? And if so, what should it pay? Right. So these are the kinds of questions that I think that the order is a bit reversed.
Yeah, interesting. So, David, do you reckon that here there is maybe room for more personalization when it comes to the way we compensate people? Because, for instance, I can imagine, okay, I'm going to obviously take an example that's maybe very obvious, but like I can imagine someone working in a sales team might be more motivated by the idea of getting a bonus if performance is adequate, whereas somebody in a completely different role might actually be much more happy with a higher base salary, for instance, because that might be more motivating to them. Whereas somebody else might, at this point in their life, really prefer a higher base salary with less bonus options, but maybe in a different point in life that will change. So I'm wondering, do you think that we will see more personalization in this area?
I think to an extent, yes, but I think companies have to be very careful about that. So what we are seeing is companies allowing more choice, right? So like maybe the overall value delivering is the same, but the vehicles that you have, you might trade off, to your point, RSUs for stock options, for example, because maybe your risk profile is a little bit different when you're younger, or you're just more naturally inclined to take on risk. Or if you're at a different life stage and you need more guaranteed pay, those are the kind of things that you might see. I think, I know you're in Europe and the UK, there's some interesting things around, benefit schemes and how you can trade one off for the other. That's really heavily dependent on the legal environment. Like you can't really do that kind of stuff in the US or in a lot of other places around the world. So I do think you will see more choice introduced. Now, when we talk about personalization to pay, that's where I think things are going to get a bit risky in the sense that at the same time, if you go down that path, the overarching trends in our field are around transparency and around equity, right? So if we allow personalization, but we aren't really certain that we're making we're calibrating talent in the right way, that we can explain why one person might be having something delivered, at a much higher value than somebody else. Like you will run into problems once those things are more transparent. And if, like for example, like you've only made personalization choices that benefit the men and haven't benefited the women, right? So like those are the kind of things that you just have to be mindful of, that the world of pay is absolutely going in a more transparent, more equitable direction. So you have to be mindful about the choices that people, like the menu of choices that you allow people to make.
David, we'd love to break this down and kind of get a sense of what makes a successful reward strategy. And I think we've talked a lot about pay up until now, but my sense anyway, correct me if I'm wrong, is that, when we talk about rewards, it goes wider even in terms of benefits and other things like that. Are there some key ingredients for a successful reward strategy in your view?
Yeah. So the overall strategy is, going to be dependent on location for sure, right? So, if you're in a chair like mine, one of the first things that you do is you look and see what is the expected market mix. In a place like Europe or a place like Latin America, that index is going to focus a lot more on well-being benefits and even things that you would never see in like the U.S., for example, like paying for lunches or certain vehicle allowances. Place like India, paying for your parents' health insurance, that kind of stuff, right? Like those are the kinds of things that you have to be mindful of the context you're operating in. And I think one of the things that we know to be true about effective rewards is that really we are kind of last in line in the sense that like a really effective plan has to be integrated with the things that are happening much further upstream. So you always start with your business strategy and say, what are we trying to achieve? And then from there, it goes to your talent strategy. Who do we need to achieve that? And then from there is the reward strategy. What is that specific talent? What do they value? What do they need? And what's going to keep them here and help us differentiate ourselves from, anybody around us. And that's where I think there's really not enough experimentation or enough integration in the overall talent strategy. We might just assume, that company, X and Y, have, if the talent is, at least similar, might have similar wants and values and needs, but that might not be true, right? I don't think there's necessarily enough, integration that happens from the data front on what employees are asking for. So I think what you see companies do a lot, or what I hope they will do more, is there's the market value, like the market data, what that says about total rewards, but then there's also what is the mission values of your organization, and then also what are your people saying. So you have to be able to integrate all three of those across your entire talent strategy, which should feed back in your business strategy. But too often what we see is, well, we've got a problem, it must be pay, right? Like people jump over those middle buckets to say, well, it's got to be pay. If we just increase their pay, if we just give them a little bit more benefits, if they've got another day off, everything is going to be sorted, right? But usually, often, what happens in the data sometimes is people leave not most often for pay. They leave because they don't like their manager, or they leave because they don't think they have interesting work to do, or they feel like they don't have a career path ahead. Now, pay, I think it's an enabler of all of those things, but it's last in line. If you get all of that stuff sorted, then pay is kind of the natural outcome of enabling the rest of your programs.
Mm-hmm. That is so true. That's so true. Actually talking about that this morning as well. And a lot of the times when people leave a company, they either leave the manager, as you say, or they leave because they feel that they don't have enough opportunity to grow within the organization. So there lies a huge opportunity for internal mobility programs to be much more effective, I think. And yeah, it is definitely not always, maybe even most of the time, it's not, because they feel that they're not being rewarded adequately.
But interesting that is the first thing that organizations tend to go to, is that pay side of it. And what I'm hearing from you, David, is that sense that you really need to strip out some of those assumptions you have on what people want from their work. You got that data, you got that quantitative side, but then pulling some qualitative data from people and actually understanding what they want out of work as well.
Yeah, and I think maybe one more point on this is one more point is, if you are in the compensation chair and the the VP of whatever comes to you and says, I'm losing talent and I can't maintain them because we're not paying competitively, right? They probably have maybe two or three, maybe just one data point in their mind. Maybe they've seen something in the newspaper, or one of their talented people has taken a bigger job elsewhere, which didn't exist at your particular company, right? So they are not necessarily comparing data at the same level that the compensation team does. So one thing to keep in mind is, if you see, an advertised rate in the newspaper, or, whatever, online, right? Because no one reads newspapers anymore. Or, there's kind of the rumor mill about compensation happening in your company. Just know that, like, those data points usually aren't actually market, right? Because they are, they're building momentum online because they're newsworthy, right? Like if something was just a normal market rate, like nobody would care enough about it to write about it, right? So it's one thing where if most companies are trying to find whatever that midpoint of the market is, where's the market moving right now, there's a natural tendency that what we're saying is probably going to lag a little bit what you are probably seeing as headlines, because again, the headlines haven't, like, our data is just kind of sitting behind, right? So oftentimes, like, our teams have a reputation for being like the Dr. Knows of the company. We say, no, you can't do this. No, that's not market. No, that's not that. And it doesn't really come from a place in most companies of, we're just trying to save money. It mostly comes from a place of, we have access to better data than you, and we think you're wrong, and we're just trying to say it nicely. So that's but again, but if you have some of those other levers out there, if people, again, if they feel engaged in their work, if they think they can grow, they've got a pathway, those are the kind of things that you can point to and say, listen, here's how your pay is going to grow, and here's how we're going to help you get there by building a big meaningful career at our company.
Do you perhaps, David, have an example of a company that's doing, that has an innovative reward strategy, or is doing this in a great way today?
Sure. I think if we look at maybe the bottom of the wage scale, where I think there is, the most opportunity to get better at this, because it affects people's livelihoods in such critical ways. There's a company called PayPal, big global payments company. They have moved away from salary surveys. I think they probably still participate and look at that data, but they're not necessarily using that as the benchmark for how they're doing pay. So they've moved to something called net disposable income. And so my understanding of their program here is they are attempting to, over the next few years, get to a point where everybody in their company, has at least 20% disposable income after what they pay them and what a reasonable set of expenses are. Now, I'm fascinated by this because I'm so curious, like, how are they, like, what does that basket of goods look like, and, how, like, what does the pay compression standards kind of up the chain look like? And I think a company like PayPal is much better positioned to do something like that than, say, a KFC or a McDonald's, right? Because, if you're working for PayPal, you're probably already doing okay, at least on a relative basis. Even, call center workers or something like that might be several rungs ahead of where that restaurant worker may be. So I think, they have some benefit of the industry that they're in, where they can be a bit more bold and experiment a bit more than others. But I think that's just such a fascinating model. I think Unilever's done something also interesting. They've got this whole fair pay framework. I might be misquoting that, but they are moving towards something around living wages for all of their workers. And living wage is an enormously complex topic, and you can define it in 1,000 different ways, and each of those have wildly different results to it. And this is part of the problem of how we do this work, is that when we talk about things like equal pay, living wage, there really is no set common definition for us to work from. So because of that, and because a lot of people in the economy just aren't making that much money, it's a pretty combustible mixture, right? So we have to figure out, maybe even starting with better definitions for what we're trying to solve. And that's where I think some experimentation is going to come through, because most companies on their own have no incentive to really try and strategically, pay a lot more than everybody else. And I think we can largely get away with that because most of the power sits on the corporate side. And I think that's where, there's all sorts of structural opportunity for us to think about pay in a different way.
Yeah, interesting how you mentioned also the example of Unilever, David. I think that I saw that they're actually trying to expand now their commitment to this living wage also to their suppliers worldwide. So very nice things happening over there, I believe, at Unilever. Going back to your book for a second, you talk about closing the wage gap as well. Not an easy thing to do, I think, to say the least. So perhaps we can start with a bit more context as to where the wage gap comes from.
Where does it come from? I don't know, thousands of years of patriarchy. Can we just call that maybe there's some of it there, but all kind of kidding aside here. But I think I think how do we close the wage gap? I think the short answer to this is we can't permanently, at least. I think this is something where, and I don't mean to be glib about that, but what I mean is if we view this as an event that we fix and then we move on, then I think we're trying to hit the wrong target. I think one of the things that is helpful for us in this conversation is, it's really about how do we build different kinds of habits in our overall HR ecosystem, employment experience ecosystem, to step back and evaluate, is everybody experiencing in our company the same level of opportunity, not necessarily the same outcomes, of course, but like the same level of opportunity for advancement, for pay growth, for, all of the things that make work, valuable to us. And maybe if we think about this from other people's perspectives, we might see, some policies might be, inadvertently disadvantageous to new mothers, for example, or we might see, some of our old systemic biases being reflected back to us in our salary surveys. So one of the examples that I think is interesting here is, in the U.S. In the 1930s, like our entire labor law ecosystem is built on basically one law from the 1930s called the Fair Labor Standards Act. And when that law was introduced, it excluded agricultural workers and a lot of service industry workers. And of course, those jobs were filled by, women and underrepresented groups for the most part, right? And so, as you're elevating the standards for where, white men worked, you're not doing the same for everybody else. And so some of that stuff is now being reflected back to us many, many decades later when we say, well, this is the market rate. It's like, well, this is just kind of compounded inertia of the systems we've created over time, right? So like there's been some element of that. I think that's part of it. I think also, the role of men in family life and taking care of their kids, just stepping in, doing the emotional and physical labor of the household. That kind of stuff is extremely important. Building policies for that, giving, again, I keep going back to the U.S., but the U.S. has no paid leave whatsoever. Right. So I know that's very different than in a place like Netherlands or France where you might, have a year or something like that, depending on the country. But that does not exist here. Right. And so We have, there's a kind of an unpaid block of time that you get, and you're guaranteed to get your job back. But those are hard life choices that new parents have to make, right? They can't necessarily just step away from work for 12 weeks because they might not be able to pay their mortgage if they do that. So, I think when we talk about wage gap, it is also just extremely critical that we talk about definitions. So we talked about this in the last question a little bit to say, there's the difference between wage gap, like pay gap, and pay equity. And like this is a really critical definition to try and sort out, because when we say pay equity, we're just saying, let's just try and control for all the things that are possible within our organization, right? We could say we pay people, the same based on their location, their experience, their, the job they're in, whatever. You can come up with a list of 100 factors, run a statistical regression on that, and then try and come up with a model to say, are these people paid, on a, within a span of our of their kind of expected value based on these values. Where they are not, where they're paid too low, companies will step in. Now, a lot of the big companies will step in and say, we're going to, because we can't explain anything, we have no other explanation, we're going to increase your pay to make sure you're back within that band. Now, that doesn't mean that you are getting paid the same as the person next to you, because you might be able to explain away those factors statistically. So this is an extremely complex thing that companies will typically outsource to a third party. That's pay equity, and that's what most companies are trying to do. Pay gap is just like taking kind of the raw math, right? To say, all of our women in the organization get paid X, all of the men in the organization get paid Y, divide X by Y, and that's the pay gap. I actually think that might be a more helpful measure, because, you can kind of control for the size of the company. You don't have to kind of hide behind 1,000 different statistical rules. And in a place like the UK, that's what we have to report on. So the UK said, hey, we're going to strip all the statistical noise out. You just have to tell us the raw wage gap, because I think that actually tells you much more interesting stories about what's going on and, across the economy, across your across society in general. And then, you get into all sorts of things like in France where you are, big companies can't collect data on race. So we have no idea, are there any gaps on those things? Whereas in the US, we can usually tell you that stuff, right? But there are infinite standards out there. And so what you typically see, in like kind of public facing write-ups about this is, people will simplify this to where the wage gap exists or the wage gap does not exist. And that is like really missing the point. The reality is, yes, it does exist. You might just be calling it something else when you say that it doesn't exist. And even then, you're wrong. Like no matter how you look at this, like there are gaps, there are problems, we have to solve them. But I think it starts with getting really crisp about the definitions we use. So in the back half of the book, I talk, a lot about what this does look like, how companies tackle this statistically, and then maybe how we can make it better in the long run.
Yeah, thanks, David. So interesting to hear you speak about that, because, on the surface, it seems like a reasonably simple thing. Like there's wage gaps, right? But it's like solving that, or even thinking about approaching it, is so much more complex than we give credence to. So, yeah, very interesting points. And even those differences between pay equity, as you're talking about, and pay gaps, and what those mean. So fantastic. One thing I'm keen to explore is just really practically, like if there's someone people listening here who have a salaried job and they don't necessarily, have power to change the system, or even in their organization have the ability to make decisions to change things. How should they be approaching like salary negotiations or different approaches to salary and pay?
Yeah. So, I think it's going to depend on, your goals and your context, right? Like if you are trying to stay at your company and wanting to evaluate whether your salary is fair, like the best thing you can do is hopefully your company makes the pay ranges available to you to say, where are you located within your own pay range? So a lot of companies, unfortunately, won't do that. And I think that makes your life much harder. And I think legislatively, that stuff is, like it's inevitable, right? Like everybody's like, there will be salary ranges. You're going to be able to access this information. This is just where the train is headed. But so if you don't have any of that access, what I would recommend is you're having a conversation with your manager around career. because you have no information to really understand. Like if you come in super hot, but what you don't know is you're like at the very top of your pay range, and you're actually doing quite well relative to your peers. Like you're not going to be successful, right? Because like if that floats back to the compensation person, and I say I don't think there's a problem here. Let's talk about this person's career and how we can accelerate their career. So it's probably not pay. It's we need to get them to that next level where new pay opportunities will open up for them. But what you might find when you have that conversation around careers is to say, hey, what does our leveling look like at the company? Where kind of am I? I might have a title that you call me, but that might not be how the HR team thinks of me, right? So, if you call yourself some of the titling that I've seen in companies recently, like it might be super vague. Like they could say, my title is creative. Honestly, what does that mean? And it's like, that could be everything. Like that could be a junior person. It could be a very senior person. But companies, I think, have an obligation to help people understand where are they really on kind of where are they benchmarked to, like what level in the organization. Most companies will have something called a leveling guide that can allow you to kind of place yourself in that regard. And then what I would say, if you do have access to, your company's leveling guide, if they make that public, look at that next level up from where you are, figure out kind of the language, and then start sprinkling that into your career conversations to say, well, it looks like to get to the next level, the things I'll need is I need to start managing a team. I need to start managing budgets. I need to, whatever it is, right? If you can unlock some of that stuff on your career plan, then naturally, like you're asking for your job to be expanded into that next level, and that's where pay opportunities come in. I think the more you can depersonalize it and focus it in on the company's processes, and where they are, where the opportunities may or may not exist for you in that company, the better off you'll be. If you come in, to your manager saying, hey, y'all aren't paying me fairly enough, I think this is a problem, like I need more money. Like if it's just about that, please know your manager probably does not have universal ability to increase your pay. They're going to have to take your story, condense it into a smaller package, and then probably shuttle it up the chain 3 or 4 more, even more levels, depending on how that stuff gets done. So your story needs to be very crisp, it needs to be very simple, and you need your manager on your side as an advocate. So to do that, you need to depersonalize the conversation wherever possible.
Great insights there, David, I think. Slightly changing tack here, and looking forward, what are, in your opinion, some of the most interesting trends you're currently seeing in the reward space?
So one of them, that I saw this word comp tech for the first time yesterday. It's like fintech, like financial technology, but for comp. And so I didn't realize that this trend was wide enough now to where we had our own term. But I think there's a lot of interesting new companies in this space around helping people manage compensation in much faster, more data-rich environments that integrate with other big ecosystems. And I'm just really interested in this space. I need to do a lot more research in it. But I think that there's always going to be a place for some of those legacy survey vendor companies, because that's where, frankly, a lot of the deep subject matter expertise sits. And the Aons of the world, the Radfords, the Willis Towers Watsons, the Mercers, all of those kind of big legacy companies. And so I'm interested to see what that looks like in the future, right? Because some of these technology platforms, whether it's Pequity or Pave or Levels.fyi, there's all sorts of these companies out there. But interestingly, a lot of them are not actually being started by compensation people. Pequity, I think, is the maybe the one exception. That person who runs that, she is ex-Google compensation leader. But everybody else is basically just a software engineer that says, we've got a problem. I think I can approach this from a software lens. So I'm just interested to see how much disruption they cause in the overall space, because again, I think the overall kind of traditional vendors, I think they are making some innovation, but maybe not as fast as they could. The other thing that I'm seeing here is, and you tell me if this is as true in Europe as it is in the US, but the shift to remote work being more permanent is I think really, really wreaking havoc on a lot of the traditional ways of doing compensation. So if you scan some of the headlines, companies like Google and Facebook have gotten absolutely destroyed in the public media for some of their stances around, increasing or lowering pay based on somebody's remote work, choice, whether they are no longer going to be in a certain city, they might be able to relocate to, anywhere within the US, for example. And, I think that has caught a lot of compensation professionals by surprise, because these companies are not doing anything new. This has been the historic practice for forever, right? Where if you move from one place to another, your pay may be affected up or down based on the lifestyle choice that you make by going remote, right? So I think companies are having to, overall, if there's one theme of this conversation, we're having to rethink a lot of our assumptions right now around how pay works. Should it be this complex? Should it be this granular? Or should we optimize for employee experience versus optimizing for, how pretty our spreadsheets look, right? So this is a really fascinating time to be in this field.
So interesting to hear you talk about that remote work piece, because you do see so many articles about that these days, where it's like, I guess it's just, like it's been happening for a while, but it's the sense that it's on a whole new scale post-COVID, where we're moving to hybrid work models, or, even full remote, where it's like, these conversations are happening on a whole new scale of moving people, and then what that means for pay. So massive trend.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Well, one final question, David, that we have before we wrap this up is what we love to finish with a lot of times is this sense of like a golden tip, or kind of like a challenge to sort of sum this up. Maybe we focus it on, business leaders or HR leaders who are listening in today, who have some power to sort of potentially reshape rewards programs and strategies. What is a challenge or an action you'd want to leave them with?
Absolutely. So I get really animated around the bottom of the wage scale, right? Because, this is where, given my history in the companies that I've been with, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly on this, companies that do a very good job and companies that have a lot of opportunity to do better. What I know to be true is that a lot of these policies are not necessarily set out of malice or about keeping people down or not letting them make more money, but because the leaders of these companies do not know what's happening. So my challenge to any business leader who might be reading this, in the same way that we talked about Dan Price earlier, who didn't know that his that hit one of his reports was working at McDonald's on the side, you should know as a business leader at all times what the lowest person in your company makes. I'm certain you know what everybody on your executive team makes. You need to know what that bottom floor rate that you're paying people are. Because once you know that, and once your compensation team knows that you know that, then they start developing all sorts of practices and processes to make sure that those rates are evaluated in equitable ways every year, that they are viewed through the lens of not just being market relevant, but being people relevant, and that you start to see a lot of movement in this space. So again, I don't think leaders approach this from a place of malice. I think it's from a place of, well, we're going to just let the comp team sort this, and you have to know what does the lowest person in your company make, and then go ask your HR team why that's the case. And if they can't justify it in a way that's resonant for you, that should theoretically light a fire under them to go fix it.
Fantastic challenge to leave listeners with. That's great. Thank you so much for your time, David. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
Pleasure. And before we leave you, listener, we just wanted to encourage you to leave us a review on this podcast. We always love seeing your comments and your ratings. Share it with a friend if you've enjoyed it, and do not forget to subscribe. Otherwise, we're going to see you again next week for another episode of The Ins and Outs of Work. See you then.
Bye.